3 seconds. That was exactly how long it took the digital invoices to betray their author. The billing data wasn't coming from an overseas shipping firm in the Cayman Islands. The IP trace currently glowing in sharp, neon green on my secondary monitor pinpointed an internal server located on this exact floor. I watched the encrypted data packets bounce across the screen in real time, forming a neat, undeniably fraudulent loop that entirely mocked the company's multi-million-dollar external firewalls. I ran the verification algorithm a second time, just to eliminate any statistical margin of error. The result remained identical. The kerning on the PDF invoices was slightly off. The sequential numbering was too perfect, lacking the natural, chaotic variance of a third-party vendor handling multiple clients. It wasn't absolute, undeniable proof yet, but it was exactly the kind of structural sloppiness arrogant insiders leave behind when they think no one is looking. And every single forged digital approval attached to those phantom payments carried Oakley Rogers' name. The coastal wind hit the third-floor windows with a heavy, rhythmic thud, rattling the thick, reinforced glass of the corporate executive office. The storm outside was intensifying by the minute, pushing a solid wall of rain against the steel framing of the building. Below me, the expansive flagship bookstore was completely dark, closed to the public for the night. Yet, the air circulating through the overhead vents still smelled deeply of old, bound paper, roasted espresso from the lobby cafe, and the aggressive, sharp salt spray from the ocean just 50 yards away. My hands remained perfectly steady over the illuminated mechanical keyboard as I sealed the trace in a heavily encrypted folder and watched the loop repeat quiet, confident, guilty. The heavy oak door to the conference room opened with a sharp, echoing click. I did not break my visual lock on the dual monitors. The blue light from the screens cast harsh, geometric shadows across the long, polished mahogany table that had served as my isolated operational base for the last 96 hours. Empty ceramic coffee cups and meticulously stacked printouts marked my territory. "The building is secured for the night," I stated, tapping a final, complex command sequence to lock the terminal. "All non-essential personnel are required to badge out by 1900 hours. Building security will initiate their sweep in 10 minutes. I don't adhere to arbitrary corporate curfews when my entire department is under a hostile, bad-faith audit." I turned my heavy leather chair. Oakley Rogers stood in the doorway. She wore a tailored navy blazer and dark, pressed trousers. The shoulders of her jacket were slightly damp from the storm outside, catching the dim light of the hallway, but her posture was completely rigid. She held a thick, physical manila file folder gripped so tightly against her side that the heavy cardboard was visibly buckling under the pressure of her hands. She walked forward, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, measuring the distance between us. She stopped on the opposite side of the massive conference table. She dropped the heavy file onto the polished wood. The thud echoed sharply in the quiet, cavernous room, a physical challenge to the digital numbers calculating on my screen. "Marcus Davis is setting me up," she said, her voice dropping into a cold, absolute register that demanded total attention. "The regional board convenes tomorrow at 10 a.m. Oakley said 10 a.m., like a blade, pinning the time to the table so it couldn't move. I watched her dark eyes do the brutal math her job, her 10 years of accumulated equity, the impending criminal charges one after another, leaving absolutely no room to breathe. Marcus Davis, the chief financial officer, didn't need to steal the expansion capital quietly. Oakley didn't flinch, but her grip tightened until the folder bowed like paper could hold the weight he was trying to drop on her name. He just needed her to look guilty on paper long enough to push her out of the company, seize control of her logistics budget, and close the internal ledger permanently. "Kaizen Collins," she continued, planting her hands firmly on the table and leaning forward. She didn't look like a woman caught in a lie. She looked like an executive preparing for a brutal, drawn-out siege. "You've been inside my operational network for 4 consecutive days. You have pulled 5 years of my historical data. You have mapped every vendor I utilize. Yet, you haven't asked me a single clarifying question. If I sign off on a lie, I lose my license?" I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat, projecting zero emotional bias into the space between us. "If I expose it, I make an exceptionally powerful enemy of the board. Either way, I don't get to be careless with the numbers. The data speaks for itself. Oakley's jaw tightened, a small muscle feathering near her ear. Davis claims my department is masking a massive deficit to cover regional expansion losses on the West Coast. I did not authorize those missing funds. I built the logistics pipeline for this company from the ground up over 8 years. I negotiated the commercial leases. I oversee 20 coastal retail locations. I track every single pallet of books, every display fixture, and every espresso machine that hits our loading docks. The deficit is currently standing at $642,410. I corrected mildly, ensuring the exact parameters of the crisis were established, and you are the final, verified signatory on the Apex Maritime accounts. A sharp flash of pure, unadulterated fury crossed her features, darkening her eyes. You are the external auditor. You have the master access codes. Are you going to hand him the empirical hammer to nail my coffin shut tomorrow morning? The rigid, defensive line of her spine finally bowed, just a fraction of a millimeter. She didn't plead for mercy. She didn't offer a tearful explanation of her innocence. She bypassed the compromised digital network entirely and brought physical paper contracts with dried ink, heavy metal staples, and a thick dust line that hadn't been touched in months. She stopped gripping the wood, picked up the heavy file, and set it flat square to the table, aligning the edges perfectly with the mahogany grain. I pulled the hard copies of the regional shipping manifest from the sub-basement archive an hour ago, Oakley stated, sliding the heavy folder across the surface toward me. Every single maritime logistics contract we hold for the West Coast expansion is in there. Apex Maritime Logistics is not an authorized corporate vendor. I did not sign those digital payment approvals. He mirrored my credentials. Physical possession requires strict verification of the source. A file handed over in a dark office is just paper until the chain of custody is established. I need to verify the exact chain of custody for these documents, I told her, standing up from my chair and deliberately buttoning my dark suit jacket. Show me exactly where you pulled these from the archive. Oakley didn't argue. She didn't complain about the lack of immediate, blind trust. She simply nodded once, her expression hardening. Follow me. We left the conference room and walked down the long, shadowed corridor. The descent was incredibly slow, the heavy mechanical gears grinding loudly against the building's slight sway in the severe coastal wind. The air grew noticeably colder as the heavy metal doors finally parted. The sharp, musty scent of degrading cellulose, damp concrete, and industrial floor wax instantly replaced the refined, filtered atmosphere of the executive floors above us. The archive room was a massive, dimly lit grid of reinforced steel shelving units mounted on industrial tracks, housing a decade of physical corporate history. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically, buzzing with a low, irritating hum as the storm outside wreaked havoc on the local power grid. Oakley navigated the labyrinthine maze without a single moment of hesitation, her spatial memory of the facility she had meticulously organized flawless. She walked to a large, cast-iron mechanical wheel at the end of an aisle and engaged the locking mechanism. She rolled the heavy steel shelves apart like she'd done it 1,000 times, competence that felt strangely comforting in a room built for dust. Row 42. Section C, she said, her voice echoing flatly against the concrete walls. She stopped in front of a long row of dense, identical cardboard banker's boxes. She pointed to a dark, narrow gap in the sequence. That is where the 2023 regional manifests are kept. I stepped closer, pulling a small, high-lumen tactical flashlight from my inside pocket to inspect the area. I clicked it on, angling the bright, harsh beam across the tops of the adjacent cardboard boxes. The thick, gray layer of dust on the box was completely unbroken, except for the precise, clean rectangular square where her specific folder had been resting. I ran the beam along the edges of the metal shelf. There were no secondary fingerprints, no wiped surfaces, no signs of hasty replacement or external tampering. The physical evidence corroborated her timeline perfectly. Your digital signature is currently attached to 54 separate, high-value transactions over the past 8 months, I said, turning off the flashlight and looking at her in the dim, shadowed aisle. The network routing unequivocally traces back to your specific terminal on the 2nd floor. Anyone auditing the surface logs would conclude you executed the transfers. Then my terminal is compromised? Oakley fired back without hesitation, holding my gaze in the near darkness. Davis controls the entire IT infrastructure. He has absolute administrative access to the server farm. He possesses the exact security clearance required to remotely mirror my credentials and completely bypass the standard two-factor authentication from his own desk. I paused, processing the variable. Her logical hypothesis aligned perfectly with the IP anomaly I had discovered less than 20 minutes ago. She had logically diagnosed her own operational failure, identified the hostile variable within the system, and brought me the physical proof required to fight it. "Let's go back upstairs," I said, my mind already running the necessary legal decryption parameters and calculating the risk variables. "I have something to show you." Back in the third-floor conference room, the storm had intensified further, heavy sheets of rain lashing violently against the panoramic glass. The sound was deafening, isolating us entirely from the rest of the city. I sat back down at my workstation, waking the monitors, minimizing the primary disbursement ledger, and opening the raw data trace. "Step around the table," I instructed. "Look at the screen." Oakley hesitated for a fraction of a second. Trust was a severe operational liability in her current, highly exposed position. Relying on an auditor meant surrendering control. But she walked around the heavy table and stood beside my chair, maintaining a strict, calculated professional distance. "This is the internal routing pathway for the Apex Maritime invoices," I said, tracking the cursor across a complex visual web of data nodes, the lines glowing bright green against the black background. "The payments are definitively authorized under your digital signature. However, the origination IP address for the initial invoice generation does not match your office terminal." Oakley leaned closer, her dark eyes scanning the glowing green code, instantly decoding the structural architecture of the data. "Where does it originate?" "It originates from a dedicated, secure server on the 4th floor," I said, hitting a keystroke to highlight the final node in a glaring, undeniable yellow. Specifically, the private subnet assigned exclusively to Marcus Davis. Oakley exhaled a sharp, harsh breath, the sound loud in the quiet room. "He's running the ghost vendor from his own floor. He assumed an external auditor would stop at the digital signature and refused to dig into the deeper, hidden subnet routing protocols," I observed, closing the window to secure the data. "But we have a critical structural problem. The IP trace is purely circumstantial evidence. Davis can easily claim his subnet was hijacked by an external threat, a sophisticated phishing attack, or a rogue employee. To prove unassailable fraud and clear your liability before tomorrow's 10 a.m. vote, I need to trace the money from the Apex Shell account to a personal asset directly controlled by him. Can you do it?" The correspondent bank trail wasn't a hack, it was mandatory international reporting, and Davis forgot it existed, I stated plainly. My firm already had a standing compliance request open because the CFO triggered a red flag threshold last month on an unrelated account. I just need to pull the final match from the database. But if Davis is alerted by the system when the query hits his internal monitors, he will initiate a retaliatory protocol. He will freeze your operational accounts immediately to force your termination before the meeting begins. "Let him try," Oakley said, crossing her arms, presenting an absolute unyielding front against the impending threat. "I will manage the fallout on the floor. I will keep the regional stores running, no matter what he shuts down. You follow the trails. I need access to your personal financial records," I requested calmly, maintaining the absolute boundaries of the audit. "To prove you did not receive the stolen funds, I must audit your private accounts to establish an irrefutable baseline of innocence. I will not execute the search without your explicit consent." Oakley held my gaze, recognizing the absolute necessity of the intrusion. "You have my explicit consent, Kaizen. Find the money." At midnight, the portal fought me for an hour over an outdated security certificate. By 1:12 a.m., the legal clearance processed, the digital gate finally opened, and the massive stream of metadata poured into my encrypted database. At 2 a.m., the conference room door opened quietly. Oakley walked in. She had not gone home. She was wearing a heavy, oversized knit sweater over her work clothes, holding two large, steaming ceramic mugs. She walked to the table, placed one mug precisely 2 inches from my right hand, and sat down in the leather chair adjacent to mine. The dark liquid smelled of rich, dark roast espresso. Black coffee, no sugar, Oakley recited quietly, taking a sip from her own mug. You ordered it on Tuesday at 0800. You didn't even look at the menu. She reached into her deep pocket and slid a small, foil-wrapped pastry across the desk until it bumped gently against the edge of my mechanical keyboard. It was a slightly bruised blueberry scone from the lobby vending machine, wrapped in crinkling foil, but it was exactly what was required. Sign here, she said, sliding the pastry over like it was a sealed document, her tone completely dry. Caloric intake is mandatory emergency funding. For the first time all week, the relentless, mechanical tension in my jaw broke, and I almost smiled. I picked up the mug. The ceramic was incredibly hot. The warmth seeped into my cold palms, providing an immediate, grounding physical sensation in a room dominated by abstract numbers and impending ruin. The metadata cross-reference is currently at 78% completion, I noted, taking a careful drink. The brew was exact. Davis was in my office this afternoon, Oakley said quietly, staring out at the rain-streaked window, watching the water distort the city lights below. He demanded the Q4 operational projections for the new coastal locations. He smiled the entire time he was talking to me. He thinks he has me entirely boxed in. His confidence is a statistical error, I replied, unwrapping the foil from the pastry. Her hand was gripping the handle of her ceramic mug so tightly her knuckles were stark white. The immense stress of the impending board vote was accumulating, threatening to crack her carefully maintained composure. She was holding the weight of 20 retail locations and hundreds of employees on her shoulders. I offered a concrete tactical adjustment. Move your chair closer, I instructed softly, breaking the heavy silence. She looked at me, a brief flash of hesitation in her eyes, before she slid her heavy leather chair 2 feet to the left. Entering my immediate physical proximity, the subtle scent of vanilla cut through the stale, recycled air of the corporate office. I reached out and gently tapped the spacebar on my keyboard, pulling up a secondary screen. It displayed a highly organized, meticulously color-coded operational calendar I had built over the last 2 hours. I accessed the database, I explained, keeping my voice level. I mapped your specific vendor deadlines, your regional staff payroll schedules, and your inventory delivery windows. I synchronized them against the projected timeline of Davis's retaliation. Oakley stared at the calendar. Every critical stress point had been identified and secured. If Davis attempts to freeze your accounts tomorrow morning, I continued, pointing to a highlighted blue note on the screen. My audit letter included emergency continuity authority, rare, but written for exactly this kind of systemic fraud. I have pre-drafted authorization overrides using the parent company's untouched emergency reserve account. We don't need to patch the system. We just legally reroute the funding through a documented, compliant channel. You will not miss a single vendor payment. She was completely silent. The ambient noise of the heavy storm outside seemed to fade entirely into the background. She reached out and placed her hand flat on the desk, her fingers resting less than an inch from my own. The proximity was highly deliberate, an undeniable physical acknowledgement of the safety I had constructed. You did this while you were tracking the metadata? She whispered. Your operational stability is the primary variable holding this company together, I stated simply. It was logical to protect it. Thank you, Kaisen, she said. I looked at her hand resting near mine. I pulled my hand back, tightened my grip on the ceramic mug, and hit the spacebar to resume the code sequence. At 0915, his freeze hit. That's when the spreadsheet became a weapon. I was in the conference room. The metadata query had finished perfectly. The screen flashed a verified, brilliant green. 3 matching timestamps, 3 matching routing codes. My phone vibrated violently against the wood table. It was Oakley. Kaisen, she said, her voice sharp and laced with pure adrenaline. Davis just made his move. Specify the action. I immediately opened a new terminal, pulling up the banking portals. My department's operational accounts are locked, all of them. Elena, the flagship manager, is already calling. Her voice is tight, and I can hear the dock noise behind her. Over the speaker, I can hear a commercial forklift backing up and a driver shouting. The delivery drivers are threatening to pull away right now because the receiving checks are bouncing at the terminal. Davis triggered a total financial freeze. He locked the master grid. My hands flew across the keyboard. I forced an entry into the root directory using my audit clearance. The screen flashed a severe warning read, "Access denied. Account suspended pending internal review. Do not leave your office," I advised, my voice dropping into a cold, hyper-focused register. "He wants a highly public confrontation to demonstrate your instability to the board. He wants you to lose your temper. I have 40 employees across 3 states who cannot purchase essential supplies." Oakley fired back, the pressure mounting. "You will not have to wait." I pulled up the emergency calendar. The POS didn't need a patch, just a funding reroute through the parent company reserve we'd already documented. I executed the pre-drafted authorization overrides. "Oakley, listen to me," I said, watching the green confirmation bars light up. "The reserve reroute is active. Tell Elena to stall the driver. The registers will reactivate within a minute after she reruns the batch." The line was silent for 10 agonizing seconds. I could hear her breathing, the sheer tension radiating through the digital connection as she relayed the order. Then, a voice in the background called out, "Oakley, it went through. The registers are online." Oakley let out a harsh, staggering breath of relief. "The network is running. The bypass will hold," I stated, grabbing the massive physical file containing the offshore routing proofs. "We do not need 48 hours. We need 10 minutes. I will meet you at the elevator banks." The air in the executive suite was climate-controlled to a precise 68 degrees, smelling of floor wax and the specific kind of expensive leather that doesn't creak. I stood in the sleek, glass-walled hallway outside the executive boardroom. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Oakley stepped out. She wore a dark gray, impeccably tailored suit. Her posture was flawless, projecting absolute, unyielding authority. She held a single, slim manila folder in her left hand. "The perimeter is secure," I told her quietly. "Let's break the door down," she replied. We walked into the boardroom together. 5 regional board members sat in heavy leather chairs. Marcus Davis stood at the head of the table, and therefore, due to the critical operational failures and the severe, ongoing mismanagement of capital funds, I motioned for the immediate termination of the Director of Operations. Davis concluded smoothly. The room went entirely silent as we walked in. "That motion is procedurally invalid, Marcus," I stated, my voice projecting clearly. "You cannot terminate an executive based on a fabricated premise." The chairman of the board frowned. "Mr. Collins, you are the external auditor. You do not have standing to disrupt this internal proceeding." "I am executing my mandate, Mr. Chairman," I replied, walking forward and dropping the massive file onto the center of the mahogany table. The heavy thud echoed sharply. "I was hired to locate $642,000 in missing capital. I have located it." Davis's confident smile faltered. "The audit is incomplete. The findings are mathematically absolute," I countered. I turned to the chairman. "The capital was actively siphoned through a ghost vendor named Apex Maritime Logistics. The digital approvals were forged using a mirrored credential exploit originating from the dedicated subnet assigned to Marcus Davis." "This is absurd," Davis snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at Oakley. "She signed the documents. Her physical authorization is on the secondary disbursement contracts." "Actually, it isn't," Oakley interjected, her voice cutting through the noise. "She stepped entirely out of my shadow. This is my fight." She opened her slim manila folder. I pulled the archived, hard copy disbursement contracts from the regional vault this morning. She walked over to the chairman and placed the document precisely in front of him. "If you review Section 4, Clause B of that specific contract," I added, "you will note a catastrophic legal error. The contract stipulates that secondary disbursements must be authorized by a bonded corporate officer with a Class A fiduciary rating. Miss Rogers holds a Class B operational rating. She is legally incapable of binding the company to that tier of financial disbursement. The signature is a forgery, and the contract fails its own internal logic. The chairman stared at the contract. One of the board members took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, the reality of the liability crashing down on them. "I can explain the routing anomaly," Davis began, panic finally seizing his throat. "There is no anomaly," I interrupted, sliding a heavily redacted bank statement across the table. The correspondent bank trail wasn't a hack, it was mandatory reporting, and Davis forgot it existed. The vendor shell was registered offshore in the Caymans, but the laundering endpoint was a separate private wealth management fund in the Bahamas. The Apex Maritime account automatically transfers its balance every 72 hours into that exact fund. The primary beneficiary of that fund is Marcus Davis. The room went dead silent. "Escort Mr. Davis to his office. Confiscate his badge and electronics. Terminate his access immediately." Security's hand closed firmly on Davis's physical badge before he could even reach for his phone to call legal counsel. He was escorted out of the room in total silence. The chairman let out a heavy breath and looked at Oakley. "Miss Rogers, the board extends its deepest apologies. Your operational accounts will be fully restored within the hour." "They are already restored," Oakley replied, her posture unyielding. "Mr. Collins bypassed the illegal freeze this morning. I expect a formal, written retraction of the allegations by end of day. It will be drafted immediately," the chairman conceded. Oakley closed her folder. "Then this meeting is concluded." We took the elevator down to the ground floor. She exhaled once in the elevator, just once, and it sounded like a life returning to a body. We walked into the flagship bookstore. The severe storm had finally broken, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised iron, but pale sunlight was finally cutting through the massive front windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floorboards. The air smelled deeply of old paper, the roasted espresso from the corner cafe, and the clean salt breeze. The store was fully operational. Customers were browsing the aisles, completely unaware of the corporate war that had just been won. The cash registers were chiming in a steady, reassuring rhythm. We stopped near the poetry section, a quiet alcove shielded by tall shelves that muffled the ambient noise of the store. Oakley leaned against the wooden edge of a display table. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, clicked the side button to lock the screen, and set it face down on the wood. "You completely dismantled him," she said, looking up at me, her dark eyes shining in the soft light. "The data simply required proper formatting," I replied, adjusting my suit jacket. "It wasn't just the data, Kaizen." Oakley took a deliberate step closer. "You stayed up for 3 days straight. You built a secondary calendar just to protect my staff. You guarded the perimeter." She smiled. She reached out and gently rested her hand on my forearm. The physical contact sent a sudden, grounding warmth through my system. Just then, Elena, the flagship store manager, walked past the aisle carrying a heavy stack of hardcover books. Oakley turned to her, keeping her hand resting comfortably under mine. She didn't step back. "Elena Loggett. If anyone challenges it, they challenge me," Oakley called out, her voice carrying a clear authority. "Please log Mr. Collins into the master security system as our permanent compliance partner." Elena smiled broadly. "Right away, Director." "Welcome aboard, Mr. Collins." Elena walked away, leaving us in the quiet aisle. Oakley reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a blue, corporate-issued access badge attached to a lanyard. "The board's security committee approved this contract before we left the room," she stated clearly, removing any ambiguity. "My decision isn't personal, it's operational. You earned this before I ever touched your sleeve." She handed me the badge like a signed contract, quiet, final, and unmistakably chosen. "I want you exactly where you are," she corrected, stepping closer. "Now, we need to address a critical logistical failure." "What failure? Are the registers down again?" "No," she said, looking at my watch. "You missed breakfast." I have plotted a route to a coastal seafood restaurant exactly 4 blocks from here. We have a dinner reservation at 6. I shook my head, a genuine smile breaking across my face. After that, all I said was, I'm here. Tomorrow at 8, my desk would be beside hers, my keycard would work, and we'd debrief over dinner, and then set boundaries in writing, like everything else that mattered. Core lesson. Real safety is earned proved in daylight and in the fine print. Green flag. He didn't promise. He built the protection and showed up. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.